Namaskara, good evening, and welcome to BIC Streams. Bangalore International Center, or BIC for short, is an inclusive and neutral platform for informed conversation, intellectual dialogue, exchange of ideas, and the arts. Today's session is titled India Outlook, 2 Points of View. Authors Akar Patel and Harsh Madhusudan with Rajiv Mantri present their outlook on India based on their recent books. With today's session, we experiment with our regular format. We have done away with a moderator for today's session. It's a listen and respond session. In the first 40 minutes, the speakers will present a summary of their takeaways from their books with 20 minutes devoted to each book. This is followed by a discussion between them for the next 20 minutes, and then finally a Q&A with the audience. To contextualize the books about a new idea of India, for the better part of seven decades after independence, the Nehruvian idea of India held sway in India's polity, even if it was not always in consonance with the views of Jawaharlal Nehru himself. 3 key features constituted the crux of the Nehruvian way, which were problematic: socialism, secularism, and non-alignment. In the early 90s, India started a gradual withdrawal from this path, but it was only in 2019, with Narendra Modi's second successive win in the general elections, that this philosophy is finally being replaced by a worldview that acknowledges India as an ancient civilization, even if a young republic, and that sees citizens as equal for developmental and other purposes. A New Idea of India by Harsh Madhusudan and Rajiv Mantri constructs and expounds on a new framework beyond the rough and tumble of partisan politics. The Prize of the Modi Years by Akar Patel is a history of India after 2014. It examines the polity across the economy, national security, foreign policy, civil society, the judiciary, laws, and governance. This evening session is in collaboration with Bangalore Literature Festival, the 10th edition of the festival, as part of the open mic series. The full bios of all the speakers will appear in the chat box, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And for the Q&A, if you have questions, observations, or anything, comments that you'd like to share with the speakers, please feel free to use the Q&A box, which is also at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And with that, over to Harsh and Rajiv.
Thank you very much, Lekha, for that thorough and brief introduction. So I'll kick off the proceedings talking about our book, A New Idea of India, first. And the key idea about the book is actually in the subtitle. So subtitle of the book, as you can see behind me, the cover, it states individual rights in a civilizational state. So there are really 2 big picture propositions. We suggest in the book that individual rights matter in both society and in the economic sphere. In society, this entails that the state and its organs should treat all citizens as equal. And unfortunately, in India, that has not been the case. Under the Nehruvian rubric, rights have been ascribed frequently to groups rather than individuals. And often the religious identity of a person has determined which law they should follow, or whether they're eligible for certain welfare benefits, and so on. So in a way, it is an inherently discriminatory regime. In the sphere of economy, individual rights entails that people should be free to trade and exchange goods and services as they like. As we all know today, standing in 2021, India remained mired in poverty for decades after independence in 1947, because we had embraced a very draconian economic approach, where the state interfered in practically all aspects of economic activity, from production via a licensing system to even price controls and even access to capital. So, for example, if you wanted to raise this year has seen a record number of IPOs, and they are being priced by the market. There is a regulatory system in place. But if we rewind 30-35 years, there was something called the Controller of Capital Issues, which decided the price. This was a government entity which decided the price. It was not left to market forces. And there were many such other distortions which actually misallocated capital, misallocated public money, price controls resulted in shortages. Anyone who's grown up in India in the 70s, 80s, 90s has experienced such a shortage economy. The younger folks obviously would not have, fortunately for them, not experienced that. And that is really the fruits of the reforms that started in the early 1990s. So once the reform process moved forward in the sort of 1990s through the early 2000s, largely under the Vajpayee government, India's economic potential was unleashed. And this reversed some of the devastating effects of draconian economic control that India had experienced. So the last 25 years have been very different from the first 40 odd years of independence. And our case is that this is so because of the clean break in sort of economic policy, and the results speak for themselves. So free enterprise has done wonders for India. Now, the second piece of the key idea is in the word civilizational state. So our case is that India isn't just a post-colonial nation state, but it is a civilizational entity. It is a civilizational republic. So the Indian nation, as some people propose, was not really created in 1947, and India was not invented by the Raj, or for that matter, any Indian freedom movement leader. So there are certain books that go by the name "The Invention of India," crediting Nehru or somebody else for creating the nation. But our case is that the Indian nation long precedes the Indian Republic, and the creation of the Republic or the formation of the Republic after independence was just one more milestone in a very long multi-millennia history of what is really an ancient civilization, what we call Bharatiya civilization or Indian civilization. So properly understood, India is a civilization that is democratically transforming into a nation through the agency of the state, and most crucially, embracing individual rights is actually perfectly in consonance with India's dharmic philosophical ethos. So that's the big high level idea. And the book has 5 chapters. And I think as we dig into some of those 5 chapters in the next 8-10 minutes, I'll hand over to Harsh now. And Harsh, if you can expound on that theme and the rest of the book, I think that will be great.
Thank you so much, Rajiv. Thank you to Lekha. Thank you to the organizers for inviting us. Taking off from where Rajiv left, I would say that India is a 5,000-year-old civilization, or X number of years old civilization. And as Rajiv mentioned, the core word there is dharma. Dharma, one understanding, one way to understand the word dharma is what sustains. And there are cosmological ideas to it. There are philosophical, there are political, there are religious, which is only one aspect of the word dharma. And so which is why we say, like, in India, secularism has to be panth nirpeksh. It should not be dharm nirpeksh. You cannot be nirpeksh or a non-partisan to dharma. You have to be a partisan of dharma, which has to be understood in a broad sense. You cannot be a partisan of any one path, any one panth or sampradaya or falsafa or any school of philosophy. So that is very interesting because that comes from the Rig Veda itself. The Rig Veda has, it says in the very end that, all people of all different tribes or different gods come together and make your peace and respect each other, because the wise people see the same underlying reality in different names. The Rig Veda also, in its understanding or in its speculations rather of the Genesis, the Christian word Genesis, what they think as the beginning of the universe, they say that we don't know who created the world. Maybe the gods created it. Maybe the gods know. Maybe the gods do not know. And I think that, so if we take these kind of Eastern / Vedic / dharmic ideas, along with the 3 Abrahamic religions, especially the 2 Abrahamic religions that are proselytizing, Islam and Christianity, and then we put them under a framework where we do not have individual rights, where we have group rights. We have religion-based personal laws. We have all kinds of scholarships which are based on religion and so on and so forth. Then we have a very big confusion because we think of religion as something personal, but it is personal for a different kind of interpretation, and in a different kind of interpretation, it is not. So I think there's a lot of shadow boxing in India around this understanding of the civilizational state, which is because some people say, well, that's another way of saying it's a two-nation theory. Well, maybe it's a two-nation theory, maybe it's not a two-nation theory. You believe the entire world is yours, but if somebody disagrees with that, well, then that's a fait accompli. So I think the India-Pakistan, for example, civilizational divide is the world's deepest civilizational divide. Rajiv and I write about that in the book. Culture is very similar in North India and Pakistan. There's a real civilizational divide. And to that extent, there is one within India as well, where there are different worldviews. Whether or not men and women should have the same inheritance, they should be allowed the same number of spouses legally, whether adoption should be legal or not. Either there is an Indian view on that or there is not. And if there is a Hindu view and a Muslim view and a Christian view, well, then we should not pretend to be secular. Then what's the problem if it's not just a Hindu Rashtra, but a Hindu Rajya as well? If you have St. Stephen's getting most of its money from the taxpayers, but having a majority or more of seats reserved for Christians, what is the basis of that? I mean, for caste-based affirmative action, we have some historical reasons. We give some reasons that you cannot change your caste, it's there by birth. Religion, obviously you can. There is a clear incentivization to change. So if we want to discuss Indian secularism, we have to go back to first principles. And I think what is very interesting about the modern Indian experiment is that after 1,000 years, and perhaps after any time, that the Indian civilization has a state. Like the Jewish people were always a Jewish people, but the people without a state is like a body without a backbone. And India did not have a unified state. It had many principalities, Hindu, Muslim, or Sikh, and later the British colonizers. And we have some kind of settlement after 1947, where we said, okay, there is 1,000 years of Islam in India, peaceful and otherwise, and we've had some settlement. This part of Jammu and Kashmir remains on this part of India. And then if in 2019, we try to basically take it to its logical conclusion, saying you cannot be half in and half outside of the Republic, because if there are clearly secessionist forces, we need to change the rules of the game. And just like there are people migrating to Karnataka or West Bengal, and nobody there shouts about demographic change. And if they do, they are scoffed at. What is so special about the demography of, for example, Jammu and Kashmir? And there's no point shadow boxing. It's basically a religious war in some people's minds, and it needs to be understood in that sense with full compassion and empathy. Of course, there are aspects of human rights and individual rights, but what's interesting about the book that we try to write is individual rights and the civilizational state. There is a yin and yang. Both are important, but both have to coexist. And therefore, we, amongst other things, we discuss Karl Popper's paradox of tolerance. We apply that to Kashmir. We give the example, for example, if we compare Kashmir with the Northern Ireland case, and in Northern Ireland, if you look at the demographic trends there, it's actually now probably a Catholic plurality. The Catholics have overtaken the Protestants there, but actually the salience of religion there has actually decreased of these different Christian sects. And of course, now after Brexit, there are chances that the island of Ireland would actually end up uniting. But for the UK, it's not a civilizational change because they're all part of the quote unquote West. I mean, the Western media, the Financial Times, Economist, Wall Street journals, right or left, they all use the word the West as a given, but somehow to discuss India as a civilization entity by Indians themselves is a bit of a no-go area. It's considered as we are not quite sure. Maybe it's too Hindutvavadi, etc. Whereas actually Nehru and Ambedkar and Gandhi were very clear that India is a civilization entity. It's very unfortunate that some Nehruvians, Gandhians, and Ambedkarites are not so clear. In fact, Perry Anderson, British Marxist writer, considered Jawaharlal Nehru to be a Hindutvavadi, and he made a statement that wherever the Hindu majority ends in India, AFSPA begins. So, well, maybe there is something to it, maybe there is something not. So the core of Indian nationhood is that underlying civilization, which is dharmic. One word for that is Hindu, and to that extent, we are a Hindu Rashtra. We are not a Hindu Rajya because not because of any fear or any concession, but because the Hindu theocracy by itself would be an oxymoron and would not just be harmful to non-Hindus, but would be harmful to Hindus themselves. So that's a separate debate because, one of the reasons why Hindutva is rising is actually the dissolution of caste boundaries because of urbanization, of industrialization, because of women being financially independent and therefore marrying across caste, changing cities. That understanding of Hindu modernity is actually, I think, what is behind this kind of neo-Hindu middle class asserting itself in a curious mix of tradition and modernity. And I think we need to understand this in a very nuanced manner, without trying to copy paste from Western frameworks of right and left. Right and left don't even work in India, right? I mean, if somebody is batting for Sharia and opposes the BJP, is that guy right wing, left wing, or does that framework not even matter? In fact, even in economics, after the mercantilist rise of China and with COVID pandemic and India also going back to some protectionism while having domestic free markets like America is also now doing, even their right and left beyond a point breaks down. So I think one of the very sad things in India is we don't talk to each other enough. We do not have to be as polarized as the American democracies right now, which is why Rajiv and I are very happy to take part in today's events. And I'm sure once we listen to Akar's presentation and then we have an open chat, we'll be able to come to maybe some commonalities, even though as disagreements remain. So I think just to conclude on that note, in the dharmic framework, whether you see it in the sense of Jain Anekantvad, right, multi-sidedness, or you think in terms of this mutual respect, the golden rule of empathy, right? Tattva-masi. And I think that kind of non-homogenizing universalism is at the bedrock of Indian democracy. I mean, Vasudev Kutumbakam is not just a slogan that it might be used occasionally for rhetorical or political reasons, but it reflects who we are, and it actually reflects the way Hinduism evolved. I mean, like if you go to Jagannath Puri, it was maybe a tribal deity which was incorporated into a broader pantheon, and that kind of assimilativeness, not a two-way assimilation, let me put it that way, two-way integration, rather than one-way assimilation is the core of our civilizational understanding. So dharma, and that we call it in the book, the original multiculturalism, small m, small c. And we need to understand this much better, because it's not, if you say you're a fundamentalist, well, it's good or bad depending on what fundamentals you're talking about. If you say you are an extremist, well, it depends you're being extreme for what. In fact, even nationalist, it depends what nation are you being a partisan of or defending. What are the core ideas or fundamentals of that nation? So I think it is very useful for us to try to dig deeper, keep an open mind. Rajiv and I have also changed our views over the years occasionally on different topics. So I look forward to this interaction, which is why we call this book A New Idea of India, unlike some of the people who call their book The Idea of India. We are very happy to discuss and update our views on a Bayesian basis. Thank you so much. Lekha, back to you.
I'd like to invite Akar on.
Thank you. And thank you to BIC, thank you to Harsh and to Rajiv for this. Thank you to those of you who have joined in. I want to speak about two vectors that define India post 2014, which I think are in some sense a departure. The first is a fierce nationalism that is turned inwards at India's minorities. And it manifests itself in two ways. One is through exclusion. So India has no Muslim chief minister today. We have 28 states. In 15 states in India, there is no Muslim minister at all. In 10 states in India, there is one Muslim minister, generally given a minority affairs. The ruling party in India has a full majority in the Lok Sabha, 303 Lok Sabha MPs, of whom none is a Muslim. In 2014, it had a full majority also, 282 seats, of whom none was a Muslim. So there is a deliberate effort to keep Muslims out. Deen Dayal Upadhyay had said that was the purpose of the Janasangh BJP, that it was, quote, the a political defeat, unquote, of Muslims, which appears to have been achieved in a significant manner. The second way in which we are going after our minorities is through persecution, specific targeting through laws. So beef lynching as a category of violence did not exist in India till 2015. Two hate trackers show us this, that 97% of all violence on the issue of beef and 100% of all the fatalities on beef have come after 2015. The question is why that year? And the Prime Minister pushed for the criminalization of beef in that year and in the year before that, in the Lok Sabha campaign that he ran. And two BJP states, Maharashtra, which used to be a BJP state then, and Haryana, responded with laws which criminalized the possession of beef, which had nothing to do with what the constitution says. And after these two states, other BJP states also responded, tightening their laws, making the punishments harsher. Today, the punishment for cattle slaughter in Gujarat is life, which is not, it's ostensibly an economic crime. No other white collar crime draws a life. And the burden of proof is reversed. So if I'm caught with a gun in my hand and there's a corpse next to me, it's for the state to prove that I committed murder. If I'm accused of having beef in my fridge or in my van, it is for me to prove that that meat is not beef. And what that has resulted in is things like a 2019 conviction of a Muslim man in Gujarat, who was accused of serving beef at his daughter's wedding. The police could not prove that the meat was beef, and the judge sentenced him to 10 years in jail, saying that it's for you to prove that the meat that was consumed weeks before was not beef. The High Court later reversed that judgment. But this is what we have been led to, that laws have triggered specific violence against the community, whose data we no longer have. Both those hate trackers that I spoke about, Hindustan Times and India Spend, have been taken down, and their editors were fired. Laws criminalizing interfaith marriage between Hindus and Muslims came after 2018. They are now in 5 BJP states. Once again, the burden of proof is reversed. It is the state does not accept the testimony of an adult woman that she converted of her own volition. It's for the man she's marrying and the family she's marrying into to prove that they did not coerce her. Conversions to Hinduism are exempted. Madhya Pradesh does not recognize somebody who goes from Islam to Hinduism. That is seen as going back to what is called ancestral faith, and that is not a crime. India has criminalized divorce for Muslims. They are the only community in this country for whom divorce, which is a civil wrong for all the other communities, is a crime. The Supreme Court held the delivery of triple talaq in one sitting to be invalid, which means that if a man were to say those 3 words to his wife in one sitting, they would not be divorced. Talaq over 3 months, said once each month, is still valid. But after this, after the Supreme Court made it invalid, Parliament passed a law which made it a crime to say these 3 words, which has led us to the situation today where if a non-Muslim man were to say those 3 words to his wife, they would not be divorced and it would not be a crime. But if a Muslim man were to say these 3 words to his wife, they would not be divorced, but it would be a crime. Gujarat has tightened laws which prevent Muslims from leaving their ghettos. 2 amendments, the last of which came last year, and which is in all the cities of the state now, require buyer and seller and people who lease and rent their properties to, on affidavit, declare their faith. And it's the collector and the district magistrate who will determine whether or not it is that the sale or the lease can go through. He or she determines this based on what they think is the proper composition of neighborhoods. There is no real ratio in the law that is defined. There are many cases that are filed regularly because Muslims are denied access to properties outside of the neighborhood. We have a situation today in Gujarat where foreigners can buy and lease property where the Gujarati Muslims cannot. Kashmir is the only part of India which where the state uses something called a pellet gun. It's a 12-gauge shotgun firing birdshot into protesters. When the Patidars were violent in 2015, I think it was, there was no use of that gun against us. About 1,000 people in Kashmir have lost their eyes because of this weapon. It's a birdshot, which is basically little ball bearings that are fired out of an unrifled barrel. And so there's no control over the spread. It has even hurt the people who use the weapon themselves. AFSPA, on January 1, 2018, the Rajya Sabha was told that all the cases that the J&K police had filed against the armed forces and the para for murder, torture, kidnap, and rape, where the FIR had been filed, the police had looked into the matter, filed a charge sheet. A permission to prosecute was not given in a single one. So there has been no prosecution of any soldier or any paramilitary personnel accused of murder, torture, kidnap, rape since 1989. Till February this year, Kashmir was denied internet in a collective punishment for 17 months. So Kashmiri children are the only ones in the country who did not have access to schooling. Kashmiri patients of COVID and their doctors are the only ones who did not have access to telemedicine. What this has done, what the series of laws has done is also in some ways change our society. So the spread of COVID has been ascribed, including by the government itself, to Muslims. The Delhi pogrom was seen as an act that the Muslims committed primarily, though they were also, for the most part, the victims. And the mob has taken over in ways that the state may or may not want. So we are told by the BJP in Gujarat that it is not behind the ban on the serving of eggs on public roads through carts, but the mob has taken over. We are told that it's not the BJP that wants Muslim migrants in the NRC region to use designated spaces that the state has given them for a prayer. It's the mob that is saying that they can't do this. There are mobs outside the hotels that are owned by Muslims in Gujarat that are saying that they ought not to be in their neighborhoods. So we have democratized and devolved this violence through laws and through specific targeting, through specific exclusion. The state has given up its monopoly over the use of force in many ways, which is one reason why the mob can actually take over. And I think that because of this devolution of the use of force, things will actually continue in the way that they are. That we will remain in this kind of space where the dominant news stories, for the most part, are those that concern faith. The second vector has to do with the economy. That post 2014, things have happened that have changed India in certain structural ways. So there are 5 crore fewer Indians working today than were working in 2013. This is government data. So the unemployment survey of 2013-14 and the survey we had this year show that there are 5 crore fewer people either working or looking for work in India today, though about 12 crore people joined the labor force. Indians are also spending less in 2018 and eating less in 2018 than we were in 2012. This is a survey that the government produced, but then refused to release, though outgoing CEA Subramaniam has asked for it to be released. The government has said no. Jobs in agriculture have gone up for the first time. So the government survey shows that for the first time post 1947, more people are going back to the farm because there are no jobs available in services and manufacturing. Manufacturing jobs halved from 5.1 crore to 2.7 crore in the last 4 years. Manrega, which was called a monument to failure, has gone up 4 times. So it was about 32,000 crore rupees in 2014. It then became 2 years later 60,000 crore. Last year it was 1 lakh, and 11,000 crore. This year, in the first 7 months, money has already run out. I think we might be able to appreciate the labor force and the shortage of people who are willing to work or have jobs by numbers that compare us with the rest of the world. So in the US, labor force participation is 60%. In Thailand, it's about 70%. In China and Vietnam, it's about 75%. In India, it's 40%. So 1/5 of it has shrunk over the last 7 years. Bangladesh, which was 50%.
Oh, okay. So jobs in agriculture went up because jobs in manufacturing went down, and manufacturing's share of GDP has gone down from 16% to 13% in the last, after Make in India was launched. There's been a sequential decline in GDP growth for 13 quarters since the beginning of 2018, from January 2018, and this is before the pandemic. So we had this kind of implosion, 87654321, and we were fairly close to zero before the pandemic hit. So there's something going on there which hasn't been examined deeply enough because of the problem of the pandemic, where the focus now is. And the assumption is that the damage to the economy comes primarily out of the pandemic, though it is clear that the data that the government itself shows reveals that not to be true. In the same period, the manufacturing share of GDP has gone up in Bangladesh and Vietnam. So it was possible for us to have taken on the Make in India plan and make it what it ought to have been, but we were not able to. The middle class has stopped growing in India. So the number of cars sold in India has been flat for 10 years at 27 lakh units. The number of residential properties in the 8 major cities has been flat for the last 10 years at 3 lakh units. Last year it was 1.5 lakh units. Even the lower middle class has actually stopped growing. So the number of two-wheelers that are sold in India have been flat for the last 5 years. On the other hand, 28,000 dollar millionaires have left India since 2014, 5,000 left last year. We had 55 new billionaires last year, but last year we also had 23 crore people more fall into poverty. So we have this situation where wealth inequality is rising, that there is a concentration of wealth in a very small number of people, and a very large number of people are suffering. 800 million people, 80 crore, that's 60% of the population, depends on 6 kilos, 5 kilos of rice and wheat and 1 kilo of dal, which comes to them free from the government, and this will come to them till the end of March. And this is primarily because of the distress. So what used to be subsidized grain has now become free, and 60% of this country now must queue up once a month for this. Lastly, on 49 out of 53 global indices since 2014, India has fallen. So if you look at conservative bodies like the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, these are bodies that are showing data that reveal that India is declining on parameters of governance across the spectrum of the polity. So I think these are the two vectors, to my mind, that would define India. One is that we have chosen as a nation under a very popular Prime Minister to go after our minorities and exclude them, which we've done fairly thoroughly. Secondly, I think we've brought the economy to a stage where it will either not be possible for us to be able to get into the ranks of the developed nations soon and perhaps ever. I think that what is coming towards us in terms of automation and AI might not give us sufficient time to move these hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And these two vectors, I think, will remain with us primarily because I don't think that they are the subject of a political debate. I think we are far too occupied in the media, in parliament, in these spaces where power resides on things that are marginal. Thank you.
So Harsh, would you like to start and then get it going?
Yes. I think. Thank you, Ravi. Thank you to Lekha, and we'll now have a more free-flowing conversation. I've been told. I think. See, I think first thing I'd like to just begin by saying, although my personal bias is towards the Bharatiya Janata Party, as far as I know, I'm not a member of the party. Never called them, never got enrolled. So I'm not here to defend any and everything that Akar or anybody else might come up with. I think having said that, I think maybe subconsciously some of the points that Akar has mentioned are very selective. I'll tell you, for example, many of his data points are starting either in 2014 or in 2012 or 2010 or 1989 or even earlier. So while the book is, I've not read the book so far, although I've read many of his columns, I don't think the book necessarily shows that this trend has accelerated on many of the data points that he has mentioned post 2014. Like, is it part of the continuing trend? Has it accelerated? Has it actually decelerated? Has it actually reversed? That's one. I think secondly, I think the consumption survey that he mentioned, just a few points on the top of my head, I didn't write about the former CE had also mentioned. I think obviously no serious economist can take that consumption has actually fallen in real terms between 2012 and 2018. I mean there is GDP growth rate of 6-7% per capita between 2012 and 2018. We have no data about Gini coefficients or inequality that, okay, the mean has gone up, but the median has gone down. So I think, there are sometimes data is just wrong. It is true that the number of cars and some things, except the COVID year, have been largely flat. They actually increased to around 4 million, not 2.7 million, as you mentioned, but 2018-19 around, but it has fallen, obviously. I'll cover the economics first, and then I'll quickly cover the religious angle, and then Akar, we can just discuss, and Rajiv can join also. I think on the economics, let us be very clear that this data is verified by, again, IMF, World Bank, not just our own data. And we have seen per capita growth of 6-7%. We are more than $3 trillion right now. In rupee terms, we'll probably be 230 lakh crores nominal GDP this year. I think, again, he mentioned some number of millionaires who had left India. So again, what is the comparison point before 2014? Clearly, people are leaving India earlier as well. Is it more? Is it less? How do you adjust it for the country's GDP? How do you compare it to a place like China, which is much richer, but politically more repressive, less where people want to go to, like Vancouver at the drop of a hat? How do you compare that to that? On the stock market, for example, is very much a barometer of what people who put their money where their mouth is, what they think about the future of the economy.
And additionally, just to interject, Harsh, there are just more millionaires being created in India, which is why there are more millionaires leaving the country. I think we're not even normalizing for that, right?
And I think even on the Gini coefficient, I think he mentioned about, he might obviously agree or concede that there are more millionaires. But how do you, there is no study as far as I know, because these surveys come with a delay of 2 or 3 years. And then, of course, we've had the pandemic, of which shows that India's Gini coefficient, especially post-transfers. So as you rightly mentioned, Akar, right, that we are 800 million people during these obviously a very emergency times are getting basically free food, which was highly subsidized earlier. And it was not 60% of the people, it is probably less. Now it is more, and it's practically free. So what is the consumption inequality post-transfers? Has even pre-pandemic or just pandemic, and has it increased compared to 2014? Has it increased compared to 2004 when we had a massive boom? So without that comparative lens, these numbers might sound overwhelming, like all numbers about India do, but they don't necessarily posit or show or display a trend. I think, in fact, in many ways, the economy is looking very, very good, partially because the state has been able to take many reforms. I think actually now, of course, that has been discontinued because of the Chinese Communist Party, but the ease of doing business rankings, India improved by 65 spots. In terms of, the GST reform, which was being discussed for 10-15 years, may not have been perfect, but has actually happened. In terms of financialization, the JAM Trinity, I have worked earlier on NREGA. He mentioned NREGA in Rajasthan for MIT Poverty Action Lab for a few months. And I saw that, they would go to the local post office. Us samay 100 rupees per day tha, today is probably 250 rupees per day. And they used to get 30-40 rupees or 60 rupees, if at all they got anything, because often the sarpanch would just divide it amongst his cronies. And they would, in the night, they would get a caterpillar or a JCB to do the actual work. So in many ways, many leakages have been actually filled in terms of getting the actual gas stove, which was not there earlier, or the electricity connection, or the water, or the power, or getting whatever NREGA money you're getting, at least is getting directly to your bank account, right? Of course, the NREGA transfers have gone up in a year of emergency. So again, I don't know if you take out this last 2 years and if you adjust for inflation and GDP, And actually, remember the last year of UPA 2 was actually very low on NREGA transfers. We were going through a fiscal crisis. I think he mentioned the starting point is 35,000 crores. UPA 2 had actually crossed 40,000, 45,000 crores in 1 or 2 years before that. So I think on the economics, let's say, I mean, I am a professional investor. So if I am actually biased, it will cost me very heavily. So we'll find out in the coming years how that plays out. I think on the religious side, I think it is very important to mention that there are many party members in the BJP, Muslim members who have Hindu vibes. So I think there's an interesting point he has mentioned about the burden of proof. I think that is something worth discussing. But I think there is no some people might be misled, even though that may not have been their intention, that Hindu-Muslim couples in India, especially if it's a Muslim man and a Hindu woman, are banned. That's not true. There are BJP senior members who are married to Hindu women and who happen to be from a Muslim background. I think what is true is, and there are many stories that where a Muslim boy or young man introduces himself with a Hindu name, there is a misleading situation about that. And we don't live in a perfect world where, for example, if the conversion happens, that the woman is not therefore subject to having 3 more wives after that. I mean, we don't have uniform laws. So sometimes if you start from a suboptimal position, you need clearly imperfect, suboptimal laws to counter that on a temporary basis. Although, of course, the long-term permanent solution is to have equal laws. For example, a Muslim man should not be allowed to have 4 wives legally. Muslim woman is not allowed to have four husbands legally. I think on beef, yeah, I agree that, if it is specifically about the burden of proof part, for me, that doesn't make sense. But of course, all countries have the right to ban a particular kind of food item. I mean, America bans horse meat. America bans dog and cat meat, killing of dogs and meats for consumption, even though actually many South Koreans and others historically have consumed that. They just don't call it as part of a religious rubric, as we also don't officially call it, because even in the constitutional directive principles, cow protection is there. Now, how you implement that is a separate issue. And I think finally on Muslim representation, I think, Rajiv, do you want to make a point? And then we'll let Akar speak so that we can be conversation.
No, thanks, sir. So, I always find this a very frankly, very odd comment that firstly, we are talking about Akar multiple times. He mentioned exclusion of minorities. Now, do you think only Muslims are minorities? Parsis, Jains, Sikhs, Christians, they aren't minorities. Don't they count as minorities? I find that you are clearly conflating minorities with only Muslims. Whereas, there are many other smaller minorities in the country. So that's the first point. The second point is, why should we go by this mindset that only, for example, with the case of Muslims, only Muslims can represent a Muslim? Or why should we go by the thinking that only a Christian can represent a Christian? So I personally find that quite pernicious, to be honest. And we very, I think, forcefully argued against that line of thinking in the book. So where we have a country driven by rule of law, where we have a written constitution, where I think no mainstream force in the country today challenges that constitution. I mean, obviously, there are always fringe groups who can say that this is not acceptable and whatever. But I don't think any mainstream political force in the country challenges that. So where we have a regime, rule-based regime, a law-based regime, why should we believe that only one particular community or a person from one community is necessary to represent that community? This was actually what Jinnah used to argue, that only Muslims can represent Muslims. So I find it very disconcerting when today's liberals are towing the same line. So I think on the point of, this line of exclusion of minorities, I would offer that. Secondly, Akar also mentioned the state has given up a monopoly on the use of force. Well, I agree that the state should have a monopoly on the use of force, and it should not be onto street mobs. But are we also prepared to use force against Kashmiri stone pelters who attack our soldiers, who have attacked security forces? And in some cases, those security forces have been brutally injured by large stones. Should we use force against, commission agents squatting on highways and disrupting public transport, disrupting public movement on national highways? Should we use force against them? should force be used against environmental activists, quote unquote, who are aligned with any element in the country, including Naxalite elements, to disrupt industrial growth. So I found it very interesting that Akar was talking about industrial growth and how that according to the statistics he cited, it was lagging and so on. But we've seen multiple cases where NGOs are responsible for disrupting industrial progress in the country. So we know about the case of the Kudankulam nuclear plant. We know about the case of the copper plant in Tamil Nadu, whose shutdown has actually turned the country into a net importer of copper. We know what happened to the aluminium plant in Odisha, and there are many other such cases where activism by certain NGOs has actually disrupted economic growth in a significant manner. These are not small projects, and this continues to happen. So we can't have it both ways. We can't have unbridled activism, and then if you push back against it, that's against democracy. But we also want economic growth, and then we conveniently cite certain statistics claiming that growth is not happening. So there needs to be some measure of balance here, I feel. And then finally, I think Harsh, we should also discuss Kashmir, because obviously that tends to be one of the most kind of controversial topics.
Yeah, but after Akar speaks, so because he also has to. This is more of a free-flowing conversation, so we'll get a chance to speak on Kashmir as well, I'm sure.
Akar?
So I think what we have done as a country is do what the rest of South Asia does, which is we are as majoritarian as they are, as the rest of them, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Lanka. But each nation has used a different route to get there. Are saying that we are suitably qualified to represent minorities and they don't need to be in parliament for them to be properly represented is something that the other nations also say. So there is no Hindu chief minister in Pakistan today. And if you were to ask somebody in Pakistan and say why that is, they would say that why would you need that? You don't need to be represented on the basis of your community. But how is a political power shared in a part of the world where voting tends to be along confessional lines for the most part? So I think that is something for us to think about. The indices that I refer to are all 2014. 1989 was what the AFSPA position in Kashmir is, which is when it came into being. And I think that for many people, the idea that the BJP alone represents a majoritarianism is quite strong. I think that Perry Anderson is quite right in many ways, that one reason partition happened was that Congress didn't want to let go of a very strong center, and they didn't want to share power with minorities, which is the way that we are even today, that we have suspicion of the federal structure. We don't want Delhi to be anything other than very strong. So I think that how a nation becomes a progressive, how the nations of the world have become a progressive, is in large measure through inclusion of all of its society. What we are doing is actively targeting one community through laws which stoke violence. I think that it's not limited to the Muslims. I think what we are doing to the Christians today in Karnataka, refusal to let them hold mass, refusal to let the poorer denominations rent a prayer hall, in Madhya Pradesh, in Haryana, in 3 states this month, we've had the same thing. So I don't think it's limited just to us going after the Muslims. I think that the thrust that has become sharper post 2014 has been against all minorities. I think Muslims, because they are the largest group and they tend to bear the brunt of what the BJP says and does, are the most visible victims of this. I think that if you stand for individual rights, how many people somebody marries is not your or my business, or who they marry. The fact is that laws that are quite primitive have been used to ensure that adults are seen as not having a free will. I think any sense of rights based on individual rights should at the first point recognize that the state cannot tell an adult, you cannot do this in terms of love. The problems with the Special Marriage Act exist and they can't be wished away. I think that for us to assume that in this part of the world, to have somebody go into a family with no problem at all, whether they marry a Hindu or they marry a Muslim, it would be quite innocent of a reality. We should also know that many states, Madhya Pradesh, and these are post 2018 laws, exclude conversions to Hinduism. So I don't know what the basis is on which we can say that this is just something that a state should do in the normal course. On some of the other points, you said on Narega, the numbers are quite clear. They used to be in the 30,000s before 2014. Then they doubled to 60,000 and then they doubled again. So while it is certainly true that things have gotten worse, the pandemic being the result of our distress is not true. I think both the collapse in GDP growth post 2018 January, the consumption expenditure figures, which are supported by a government survey on health, that we found that in many states, including Bengal, Gujarat, and Maharashtra, the number of stunted and wasted children had gone up in some states over 2005. So to assume that purely because of the fact that the government says the government's reason, the cited reason was that, well, GDP numbers tend to show that a private final consumption is at this number. But that's also not based on anything other than what it itself digs out. And I think it would be prudent for us to look purely at the government numbers. For the government to discard its own survey saying that, you know, it doesn't match with the numbers we have elsewhere, I don't think is the way to go about something which is so dire. I think the problem, if it is true in some way that consumption is lower, that, you know, people are eating less, it ought to be addressed. I think one of the problems of the post 2014 period is that it is not actually addressed. That we are fine with looking away, we are fine with issues that are linked to things such as temples and so on, while we do not look at material that is coming to us daily. It is not the case that the automobile sales, the two-wheeler sales, a collapse has come because of COVID. The reason that the Niti Aayog cited was that this was because of Uber and Ola. In the same period, Uber was founded in 2009. US car sales have gone up by 80%. The Chinese have more than doubled. We have remained flat.
So I'll answer some of these points. I think, you know, first of all, there is a macroeconomic cycle. There's a strong dollar cycle, weak dollar cycle. Let's not go too much into finance, but basically 2011, when as the dollar peaked, dollar index peaked, all emerging markets do terrible when the dollar is strong. All emerging markets do better when the dollar is weak. 2002 to 2011 was when the dollar was weak. Therefore, emerging economies like India did well. In the strong dollar phase, they tend to do different. It's true that China went into a different gravitational sphere altogether, but you can compare Brazil, Russia, South Africa. Actually, India has, if you do a comparative analysis of Indian GDP growth to either BRICS growth or emerging market growths in general, India has actually done better in the either post 2011-12, or if you want to count from 2014 till now period, compared to the ratio it was from 2002 or 4 to 2009 or 11. So ultimately, it is the ratio. There is a part of a dollar cycle based on which emerging market grows and emerging markets don't grow. For example, the banking NPA thing is not something that happened in 2014. You, of course, clear it during 2014. The real estate boom happens, and then there is a cyclical real estate consolidation phase, which I think has basically ended this year. We'll see in the next few years. So I think there's a cyclical element. How much can we correlate that to the policy inputs of a particular government starting a particular date? I think that may be academically less concrete. I think on the survey part, I think it's survey consumption being less in 2018 on a real basis compared to 2012 is just very, very unlikely. It's got nothing to do with the government in power. Again, this is real GDP growth that is being measured across international agencies. So sometimes surveys can go wrong. I think just because a survey has said something, it doesn't mean you should therefore agree with it, because that can actually lead to wrong policy. Now, I think on religion, very quickly, I think, see, you might have a position that polygamy must be legal, but okay, let us say, for argument's sake, that is a situation. It should be true for all genders and all religions. The problem right now is not that polygamy per se is a problem.
The problem is religion-specific laws,
Well, religion, and in this case, gender-specific laws.
gender-specific laws.
If you talk to some Maulana, he says, one man should be allowed 4 wives and not vice versa because you don't know whose child it is. Well, we live in the age of DNA, right? So the problem is you're basically trying to implement Fatwa Alamgiri, which was the Sunni Hanafi code brought together by Aurangzeb. And now that is part of a secular liberal disposition. If you touch that, somehow you are being an anti-Muslim bigot. No, the laws have to be the same for everybody. When a Indian Muslim migrates to Australia or the UK or Canada or the US, you have the same laws for everybody. It is true, for example, that a case might be made for customization of marriages or some kind of pre-nup or post-nup or this and that, but that is customization at the individual level. You're not saying कि तुम इस religion के हो, therefore तुमको 4 allowed है, उसको नहीं allowed है, तुमको adoption नहीं allowed है, उसको adoption allowed है. That is what the problem is, right? If something is good for somebody, presumably it is good for everybody. If it is not good for some people, presumably it is not good for the other people as well. So either it is a soft bigotry of low expectations, or we actually want to only help Muslims. Which one is it? Neither of one is very flattering. And I think
Harsh, I would also like to point out, Akar mentioned about criminalization of divorce, the triple talaq matter. We should also remember that even for other people in India, the pro-women progressive laws we have are, some people argue, very harsh on men. So when it comes to things like dowry laws, for example, just a claim by a person can put a lot of families in trouble. Whether the claim is verified later. First, the family has to answer whether you did this or not, and they are presumed guilty. In certain cases with dowry laws and other kinds of, even when it comes to violence in a marriage situation, those laws are like that. Broadly speaking, it is not a specific case that only triple talaq is criminalized. So, and there are documented cases. There are certain NGOs who are working. Actually, they call themselves pro-men NGOs because there are families which have suffered from these laws. So I just want to put that out there, that to claim that this is somehow a victimization of Muslims, I don't think it's reasonable.
And for example, just to kind of push back on the economy point, you see HDFC, Kotak Bank. Sorry, Akar, go ahead.
Thanks. So I think that there might be some confusion on this. So the triple talaq thing, it punishes a non-event. Even if we assume that those 3 words are said, the divorce is not valid. The marriage is intact, but we still punish it. That is the difference. It could be the case that the dowry charge is false. It could be the case that the dowry charge is true. But what we are saying is the Indian state is going to punish something which is not valid. It's not an act. And they are the only community that face it.
No, but why would somebody say it if it's not valid?
Exactly. What does that mean?
The law says it's not valid. The law says the marriage is intact.
So, but why would anybody want to say if it's not valid?
How do you know that they actually said it?
And this is the only community which has divorce of this type, right? Oral divorce. Other communities don't.
Oral instantaneous divorce was.
Yeah, oral instantaneous divorce. No other community has it.
It is not valid. It just becomes words. At the point when the Supreme Court said that divorce cannot be offered in this way, it is not.
Well, I don't know how Muslim women feel about it.
Akar, just to step in here. For example, if it's not valid, that's true. But one can make an argument if somebody is taking 10,000 rupees during marriage, who is it hurting? It's all voluntary. They're all adults, as you were saying about polygamy, right?
Yeah, so why criminalize that?
Point.
So there is social engineering implicit in all states.
No,
why should dowry be criminalized by that logic if they're both adults?
I didn't understand the.
No, for example, you mentioned, right? For example, that if somebody wants to have multiple wives, it's between adults, and that's fine. So then, why should, by that logic, dowry be criminalized? If some adult is giving some money for a marriage, that's fine. But we have some implicit social engineering in our laws.
No, I have no specific opposition on the issue of dowry. My question to you is this: that let us say that on the matter of dowry, either it is true that the accusation is made and it is valid, or it is not.
No, I'm asking a different question. I'm saying, what about the fact that dowry should not be criminalized in the first place in that kind of very laissez-faire framework?
I think that the broad way that I would look at it is that with the kind of acceptability and majority that the Hindutva party has, if it doesn't like laws, it should get rid of them. I think that many things that don't find opposition, including, say, the takeover of temples and things like that, it appears to me to be the case that there is no real resistance to things that they want done, or at least they say they want done, but are not doing. I don't think that if the government were to say we are going to, as they did in Uttarakhand, they tried to go after the temples and then they sort of release them. I don't really know why it is that if there are such strong feelings on these issues, why they are not being acted on.
I think just on that specific point, I think there is some internal discussion whether the time is right or not. I think broadly it should be done. I'm not sure, but I'm just speculating that whether are we ready from a caste-free point of view to go all out on that. Of course, directionally it must be done. But I was simply saying that, these are all imperfect laws. I agree with you, Akar, that the fact that something is not valid, and then you say, but still saying it is problematic, from a classical liberal point of view, sounds problematic. It is definitely not a first best solution. But then the context is such that there is that particular, if that is happening in that context, women are very, very marginalized in terms of power. For example, a classic situation is wearing burqa or niqab. Now, you could say burqa and niqab is ultimately an individual choice, but you understand and I understand. If you're staying in a family and there is a clear direct or indirect coercions, it may not exactly be a free choice, right? So therefore, there are states which, rightly or wrongly, and we can debate that separately, make laws to kind of make it slightly more even. I mean, why should there be any affirmative action technically? Technically, all we are.
No, actually, somebody, Suman Joshi ji raised this question on, regarding representation. Would you say that women don't have to be in parliament to be heard? And that does not cut it for representative politics. So just wanted to address that quickly. So as we write in the book, actually, when it comes to caste and, sorry, can I, yeah.
Let me just answer the previous one and then we can discuss. So I think for me, one idea of what a liberal state ought to do certainly precludes the fact that the state can tell adults how it is that they should lead their personal lives. I think I would not accept the fact that there is some notion of a coercion, which I think is a traditional view. I think conservative states would say, and I think a conservative in the religious sense and not in the sense of the right and left, that we should chaperone adult women because they might be under pressure. So I think that this would be an absolute black and white issue for me, and I don't think that it would be acceptable for me to have in 2021 laws passed. And these are all new laws. These are not laws that have come.
No, but there's no chaperone here, right? So if a woman has the right to go to a court and say that this has happened with me, just as it is with dowry. No one is chaperoning anyone here. No one is looking over your head.
So the 5 BJP so-called love jihad laws say that the burden of proof on the conversion is not on the woman. It's on the man and the family, except if the conversion is into Hinduism. I don't think that this falls.
Well, maybe Hindu marriage laws and Muslim marriage laws should be equal to begin with for that argument to be
absolutely
right. For example,
let's have a uniform civil code. Let's do away with this whole cobweb.
Inheritance in terms of equality, for example, in Muslim inheritance, or besides polygamy, classical Muslim inheritance law, like women gets half the property as a man, right? So and then there were issues with adoption as well. So if and of course there are issues.
As a liberal, Akar, I would like to ask you: do you support a uniform civil code? Do you support equal laws for everybody?
It would depend on what you mean by that. I think that would you restrict a non-Muslim's right to have multiple spouses?
See, I don't see that question in that detail. I think whatever is true or good, as we decide as a polity, it could be polygamy, it could be monogamy. But my point is that should not depend on your religion. That is the point. Not that whether you restrict or not.
The state cannot say, show me your religion and I'll show you the law.
That is what
that we argue that is not proper.
So I think that that needs to be broken down to the level of the individual. For me to tell a woman today that you will not be treated as an adult because other people in another community have these rights and therefore you shouldn't have your right, I think is the wrong way of beginning an argument. How do you address somebody who's a woman who says, okay, there's a problem that I have? And to my mind, I think that to say, okay, she can wait while we settle something else, is I think the wrong way of going about it.
But why should Muslim women wait? Who are
Yeah,
not
why
getting
should-
equal rights?
exactly.
Forget somebody converting who are
Right.
already Muslim women.
Wait for
Why
what?
should they wait?
Wait for what?
Wait for example, equal inheritance, not having multiple co-wives.
It is those inheritances that are intestate, that where somebody dies intestate, which go in. You could as a person.
No, but why should the default? Why should the
But why should the Republic of India have religion-based laws?
No. My
The
point is,
Republic of India.
I have no problem with the reform of either the Hindu code or the codes that determine family law.
I don't think there should be a Hindu code at all. Actually, I don't think there should be
There
Hindu
should be
underwear in
no,
family.
yeah,
That's not either.
absolutely. Why have religion-based codes?
Sure. I mean, the fact is, if you can bring agreement, one of the problems that the Hindu code bill faced and why, Ambedkar left is that the Hindu conservatives didn't want women and widows to get the
But
kind
they
of...
lost. But they lost.
And to his credit, Nehru pushed that through. To his eternal credit, he pushed that through. So why can't we have that reform for the rest of India?
So I'm saying that we ought to recognize that this is not a Muslim issue, that there are forces within all communities that will resist the devolution of power from
No, but right
To the
now,
best of my knowledge, there is no Jain, Maulana or Jain guru who's dictating how women should live their
Tell me
life.
something, and this is purely for my knowledge, since I don't know. Since this weighs so heavily on many people, why is it not being pushed through the Lok Sabha at least?
I'm sure it will happen. Just
I'm
like
confident it will happen soon.
T70 happened. I'm
hopeful
sure it will
happen
happen.
soon. But what I would equally like to ask you, Akar, is why is the self-described liberal secular community not raising this issue? Why
Of
doesn't
what?
this bother the rest of you?
Of what?
I mean, the liberal secular, the self-described
that
secular liberals.
Triple Talaq has had a very strong section of people within Muslim women that supported the fact that it should be made invalid. So I don't think it's true to say that on many of these.
No, I agree.
I'm not talking about Muslim.
No, I agree with you,
I'm
Akar, that it is
talking
not
about the
representative
intelligentsia.
of all Muslims. I'll just, Rajiv, one second. I agree with Akar that, by the way, it is actually not representative of all Muslims. It probably might be a representative of only Muslim conservatives who might be much more dominant in a vocal sense, may or may not be numerically dominant, maybe a plurality, may or not be majority. But the point is, if they are not dominant, it becomes even more incumbent, therefore, from a liberal point of view, to want to ask for it. And I think, let us be very honest, the point is, the real resistance to this is, they see this as a loss of Sharia.
No, but it has been made invalid, right?
No, I'm not talking about triple talaq. I'm talking about the overall going away of Sharia from the personal laws. It's already gone from criminal laws.
One strange thing is that since the mid-90s, Pakistan has started letting go of Sharia. So if you look at the criminal sections on, say, rape, they have been returned from Sharia to the penal code.
Yeah, well, after Zia made it very impractical, I agree, yes.
If you look at the had hudud punishments on fornication, on alcohol, there's been a freeze on all of them. The punishments on alcohol have been read down. And I think that it's sort of striking that in the same period, we appear to be moving in another way. So I think both Pakistan and India are coming closer.
But what is the Hindu
Starting
equivalent
points are
of
very
that?
different.
There is no Hindu equivalent of all these statutes. There's nothing like that.
True. I'm saying that what we do have is the ability to use the secular constitution to persecute minorities in sort of other ways. So if you say that you'll reverse the burden of proof,
let me just say one thing.
Just one thing on.
Excuse me, I need to come in here. Rajiv, There are
Yeah.
also questions we need to take. So I think I'll request Lekha to read out the questions.
I just have one
Just,
point.
I want to make one point on, Akar was comparing India with other South Asian countries. I just want to point out that in Pakistan, by law, you cannot have a non-Muslim president. I don't think you can have a non-Muslim prime minister. There is no such law in India. And, we should keep these distinctions in mind. I don't think it's reasonable to say that now we are becoming like Pakistan. Well, in Pakistan, if you're a non-Muslim, you literally are not allowed to hold the high offices.
No, I just want to add one thing. One which is factually not correct is that they actually have reservation for minority MNAs in the National Assembly, the Rana of Umaid Court and Amar Court. So actually they actually do that kind of tokenism in Pakistan by law, but you cannot be prime minister president. The Hindu marriages have not been fully civilly legalized yet, so they're all technically in their language illegitimate children of Hindus in Sindh especially. And finally, the law to prevent forced conversion of Hindu women has still not gone through. It has fallen through with the Maulanas. The PTI said it would actually help pass it, and now it has backed off. So the law is actually technically and only against forced conversion, and that law is not being passed. So in Pakistan, you don't need to be right-wing because the starting position is right-wing. From the 1953 Anti-Ahmadi Acts to 1974, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, even before Zia. So in Pakistan, and Punloka left wing is our far right. So there is no point even discussing Pakistan in any rational sense.
Both the side of the economy where they sort of liberalize, they began their liberalization phase much before us. And on the side of law, they appear to be moving, like they started out wanting to be communal, but they are finding that it's very difficult to remain communal, and they're becoming kind of.
Well, let us see what is happening with TLP right now. It's in front of you.
India started off wanting to be secular, but I think we seem to be moving towards them, trying to figure out how.
There was a Muslim chief minister of Maharashtra in the 1980s, right? Hindus were voting. Hindus were the dominant majority.
There's been more than one Muslim president of India.
No, president to chalo log bolte chalo fine. XYZ token. I'm talking there is a
the
chief
sovereign
minister
of the country, right? So
with the world, India's largest economy state, Mr. Antony was the chief minister of Maharashtra in 1980s. Hindus voted for it, right? And why is that? So if we also need to do some introspection that if there is a Kamlesh Tiwari
voted in a presidential way, I think that so Antule was not voted in as chief minister. But anyway, this is like a separate.
No, my point is Kamlesh Tiwari in UP, Uttar Pradesh, got the National Security Act against him.
Can we go to the questions?
Yeah, let's go to the questions.
Yes, as interesting as this conversation is, we have several questions from the audiences. Suman Joshi has a few questions. How do you reconcile individual rights and castes and the caste system, which is the epitome of group identity, unless you solve for the feudal nature of society? I don't think we can talk of individual rights. Don't you think so? Her second question is regarding representation. Would you say that women don't have to be in parliament to be heard? That does not cut it for representative politics.
I'll answer the caste one first. I think you're absolutely right. I am against any kind of birth-based, we have written in the book, lineage. In fact, one of the key theses of the book is that the caste system is dissolving because of industrialization, urbanization, female education, female financial independence, and therefore being able to choose their partners and spouses across castes. I think that anyway, my understanding from what I've read about from the Rig Veda and others, that Varna was supposed to be by your guna and your karma, was not supposed to be by your birth, or more technically your lineage. Although two brothers could have different qualities by birth to the same biological parents. So the caste system absolutely has to go. It is very much a remnant of the socio-economic feudalism. We do need affirmative action for the transition period based on caste, but it has to obviously have some kind of conceptual sunset clause. So I'm in full agreement that in fact in many ways the dissolution of the caste system is what is leading to a broader Hindu or dharmic identity. Ironically, the people who are actually very uncomfortable with that are the people who are right now in the political opposition. For example, some Congress MP would say the Brahmins of UP are very unhappy right now with this party, and so on and so forth. So I fully agree with
Akhilesh Yadav recently said that the deputy CM of Uttar Pradesh should go back to cleaning. He literally said this in a public meeting recently. So making a casteist remark like that in an open forum is not lost on certain key opposition leader. So they are obviously uncomfortable actually.
Akar, do you want to take the second question on
Yeah,
female
so I think
representation?
that it's that in our part of the world and in our lived reality, it would not be right for us to assume that women would not want specific representation in a
I agree
legislative.
with you.
And I think that while we like a lot of the progress that has been made in the Nordic nations, etc., has been because of the fact that there has been societal pressure for the lack of inclusion, whether it is based on gender, especially on gender, but also on faith and also on race. And that has led to the kind of diversity we see in Parliament in Canada, which has more Sikhs than we have in the Lok Sabha. I think that they are more open to looking at people outside of their own, race and what they would see as normalized, Canadians. They have a much more open mind than I think many of us do. And I think that it's absolutely right that women should expect that they should have.
No, I will only point out that unlike gender and caste, one can convert religions, right? You can change your religion. And again, in the book, we talk about this. We feel that reservations are to some extent justified on gender and caste lines because those are hard to change. Whereas if you actually have religion-based reservations, is that an incentive to convert? Probably yes. And we are already seeing that in certain educational institutions in India, which are centrally funded, government funded, but they have reservations for Christians, for example. The iconic St. Stephen's College is an example of that. Where
one solution to that, which we haven't considered, which has been proposed from within the government, including by the Sachar committee, is to extend what is already the OBC reservations to non-Hindus, to the Muslims and Christians.
It already covers them. It already covers them in various states. No, in many
several states it does.
OBC.
So Dalit Christians are not recognized and Dalit Muslims are not
No,
recognized.
Dalits are not, but OBCs are.
Correct. So I'm saying that one way of trying to see whether we can solve what was just raised would be to try and make sure that everybody from a particular background is able to benefit.
See, I think. See, I'll just add. I think
we have a strange situation in India today where Adivasi Muslims have reservations, but Dalit Muslims don't.
Yeah.
So I think that's.
No, I think OBC and ST is religion neutral. I think SC is not religion neutral. And I think there is a good reason to see OBC in India is technically not other backward caste, it is other backward class. And there is obviously scheduled tribe.
Sorry, could you also just speak to the point about women, because that was what the question was. Sorry that we got. Sorry.
Yeah, so I'll speak to that point. I agree that we given anyways that we do not have we have, for example, anti-defection laws in India. So basically, in many ways, we are electing a party and not necessarily an individual legislator. I think to that extent, just like we have SC quotas, rotating seats, I think we should need reservation for women within the parliament. I agree.
Okay.
Next set of questions from Nikhil Murthy also has several. We're going to pick a few. How do Mr. Mantri and Mr. Madhusudan talk about individual rights matter when UAPA happens, the recent Nagaland event, AFSPA, CA and RC, the current state of Kashmir, rise in vigilante attacks on minorities, the beef rights that Mr. Patel talks about, collective punishments, anti-interfaith marriage laws, etc. Wasn't this to be expected when a group that relies on paramilitaries took over? When they talk of individual rights, why do they only talk of business rights and restriction of minority rights? His second question is, should we
take one question first and then go for the next?
No, actually, just on restriction, well, actually, individual rights will increase liberties for minorities. No one is restricting, at least we're not suggesting in our book that minority rights should be restricted. A uniform civil code will actually increase minority liberties and freedoms.
No, so I just want, first of all, we are not only talking about business rights. I think we are talking about individual rights because we are juxtaposing that against group rights. So what we are saying is that laws, as much as possible, especially on the element of religion, should focus on the individual citizen as the unit of state policy and not as the religious group, which, by the way, once again, as Akar was mentioning about Canada, that's also the situation in Canada. Canada does not have different laws for different religions for marriage, divorce, inheritance, etc. So that is basically we are asking for the Canadian position, to take an example in that case. Now, on the question of vigilante violence and so-called justice, which is basically injustice, I and Rajiv, we are fully against that. Now, Akar mentioned a couple of hate trackers which began in 2014-15 and were closed in 2018. I don't agree that these things never happened before. Whether to what extent do you document that or do you not document that? How much is documented in the English media? How much in the vernacular media? A separate question. There are, if you can go Google right now, you'll find dozens of the cases where a Hindu man is marrying a Muslim woman or is dating a Muslim woman, and he gets killed by the conservative relatives of the Muslim girl/woman, including sometimes the Muslim girl/woman herself. At that point, the individual right of the Muslim girl, who happens to be from a Muslim background, is not relevant for the left liberal discourse at all in this country. She is just collateral damage.
Lynching, sorry, the hate tracker was specific to beef lynching.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying, even for beef
Is it your
lynching,
case that
I would be very
lynchings never happened before 2014? Is it your
That is
case
what the
that
data that these people gathered said, yes.
Yeah, I really doubt that data, because
yeah,
actually
it's so credible?
I find we've actually quoted Wilkinson, Stephen Wilkinson, with whom Ashutosh Varshni has also written some papers in the book, and we've actually found in Wilkinson's paper that as consocialism increases, intercommunal violence increases. Consocialism means more and more laws based on religion. So I would be very surprised if there was no killings based on cow in Haryana or Rajasthan before 2014. These are very deeply conservative states.
Sorry, I think that just for listeners, that the state in India doesn't record hate crimes as a specific category. So you need to look at secondary data, which is
yes, exactly. So these are often from scraped from newspaper, often English media. We all know that English,
and they have their own
not
biases.
just English, I should say that.
Yeah, and not just bias, they have a very clear bias. For example, when the victim is a Muslim and the villain is a Hindu, they would identify the religions, and vice versa, they would say community.
They kind of wash it out. They don't.
So often what happens is if you scrape it in an online database.
I should say that I have looked at their data and they have not done that. That there is specific reference.
Well, maybe there's a selection bias, even if it's not conscious. So I would not take it in an academically rigorous manner that it became 95% post 2014 and was 5%
of all.
Yeah. So I am not saying it's technically not possible. I would take it with a pinch of salt, because our society, as you saying about Perry Anderson and yeah.
Sorry, and next question.
Lekha, just sorry, how many do you have?
We have 22 at the moment. We're going to pick at maybe we have time for 4 maybe.
Okay.
Yes, Nitin Kalavkar says he completely resonates with the authors, that is Harsh and Rajiv, on the dharmic foundations of Bharat and the need to decolonize our foundations for constitution, culture, and education. He would like to know if there are any concrete steps this government is taking in a time-bound manner.
So I see. I think I'm not sure for dharmic state the government needs to take many steps, except, as you said, be panth nirpeksh, do not be dharm nirpeksh, part of which is Uniform Civil Code. They are bringing the pride back in terms of the Ram Janmabhoomi, and for example, what the government has done for Kashi Vishwanath, where the original temple was destroyed by Aurangzeb in the 17th century, and the Gyanvapi Masjid stands there. At least we are now making that area more beautiful. I think more broadly, yoga has been kind of exported globally, like Alan Watts once called Buddhism to be Hinduism for export. So I think right now in 7 years, mostly it's just in terms of, well, of course, Kashmir, I don't know whether you should take it as a dharmic issue or as a geopolitical issue. It's a bit of both. I think Kashmir is where the most significant concrete progress has happened. And I would just like to very briefly speak, because Akar mentioned on Kashmir. I think it is once again important for us to understand, what does Kashmir represent? The Kashmir Valley, which is basically mostly Sunni Muslim, if they are wanting to basically secede from India on the basis of religion, there is no other, there is no other denominator for that ethnic secession except religion. Then what does that foretell for the religious minorities in the rest of India? What does that say about the final settlement of the partition? Because when people say, don't go back to partition all the time, what is Kashmir? If we do not have a consensus across all shades of opinion in India on Kashmir, I think it is extremely dangerous. Because people will make their own conclusions about the future of Kerala, Bengal, Assam, and other bordering areas going forward. We need to have a non-absolutist, more contextual take on Kashmir while being completely intellectually honest. So I think Article 370 is a big part.
Whether the majority in the valley wants to secede or not, or should we not, or should we not have the plebiscite?
I don't know. I don't think we should have the plebiscite. Why should we have the plebiscite?
Then how do you know that they want to secede?
Maybe they don't. Great. Maybe they don't. Maybe people who are coming out to stone the armed forces when a terrorist dies are not representative of the people.
So I think that if you have,
Maybe it's a plurality, loud plurality. Maybe it's not a majority. Actually, we are.
No, and again, Akar was saying that the state has given up a monopoly on the use of force. So what should the state do in Kashmir? Should they use force?
I think that one of the problems that we have is that we are insufficiently sovereign. So we wanted to ensure that Kashmiris didn't have internet, but because the US Congress had this motion against us, and then the president shifted from Republican to Democrat, we felt the pressure to be able to lift what was a collective punishment. So 17 months.
I don't know how you're concluding that. I mean, I would say once the situation was stabilized, then the government in its own view must have taken a decision.
So why did that increase after the net thing was lifted in the last 3-4 months? So I don't know what the basis of the decision was that the government took. But I think that it is wrong that you collectively punish a state.
I think it is a war zone. I agree with
it. It is a war zone, yes. So if we have to maintain order over there,
okay. So
I am very sure that if things had gotten violent in Kashmir, then the same people today who are saying why did the internet get shut would be on the other side saying look what the government did.
I should tell viewers and listeners one thing, which is that violence peaked in Jammu and Kashmir in 2001 when 4,000 people died. And it's been sequentially dropping for 20 years. And since 2012, actually, it's been only 200 or 300 people. It was 400 or 500 people a few years ago. The point is that at the point in time in our history when there was no internet and there was no cell phone, violence was at its peak. And it's not at its peak now. So for us to assume that...
I think 370 repeal was so
that was a serious action that would have precipitated, we don't know obviously, but my guess is that any responsible government did the right thing.
Tell me something,
and
I want to know this from the two of you, and I ask this to understand. Do you think collective punishment is correct of this sort? And if so, what are the parameters on which it should be enforced?
So I don't see
this is collective punishment at all. Actually,
I think for example in Haryana, I think for example in the farmer protests were going on, often the internet was cut down from 4G to 2G.
Yeah.
So you can talk about different levels of quote unquote punishment. What you see as punishment, what I see as the state taking administrative decisions to prevent violence. Were we collectively punishing Haryanvis?
Months of children not being able to access.
No, I'm simply saying, were we collectively?
It can have downstream effects, but what do we want first? We want order. We want peace.
That is what I want
stability.
So you're saying that there is a hierarchy that you would sort of.
No, I'm asking, like, were we collectively punishing Haryanvis when we did that for the farmer protests? We were not.
How many days was it cut off for?
No. I'm simply saying, as a matter of principle, was that
the days cut off would depend on the degree of the threat, and the degree of the potential violence or outbreak.
One of the problems we have as a country is that we are, for some reason, the leading perpetrator of internet cuts in the world, like a shutdown. We are the.
I don't think we're ahead of China in terms of censorship. Let's not go there.
Because we are free society, so we have to cut more frequently. Yes. I suppose. You know, you were mentioning Vietnam, even Bangladesh is for all practical purposes a one-party state. China obviously has perfected authoritarianism for the time being.
Like them.
No. Within a free society, you have to understand that order and liberty are a yin and yang. Like, we've written in the book, you can't have John Locke without Thomas Hobbes.
So if I
can't have John Stuart Mill,
right, would place order above liberty.
No, it's not about above. It's that without order you cannot have liberty.
Right. Okay.
It's not
we need the state to enforce order, and then we can talk about freedoms.
Otherwise, we'll have
in a country of chaos. Like you take some small African country which is in a perpetual state of chaos. I mean, they don't have order. They don't have liberty too.
Maybe you can add your answer to the next question. So that
Yes, unfortunately, we have run out of time, and I'm going to like sort of ask one last question. This is from Mr. Mohan Rao. Mohan Rao wonders if Harsh and Rajiv have read Mr. Patel's book before commenting. As a public health professional, he can attest to the deceleration of health indices even before the pandemic. Our levels of stunting and wasting in children has increased. Our maternal mortality rate decline has also decelerated. And Mr. Rao also says that we do not need uniform laws, we need gender just laws, even among Hindus.
So I'll answer that question very, very soon by first simply taking Akar's advice to append my last answer by saying that yes, we need order because otherwise the Kashmiri Hindus would be thrown out, whoever the minorities are. So first thing we need is orders. I think on the point of the public health professional, the question that he's asking the gentleman, obviously maternal mortality rate decline decelerates. If it does not decelerate, it will go below zero. So I think that's just a mathematical property. Not just maternal mortality rate, but even infant mortality rates are falling. Yes, the fall might be decelerating, which actually shows that the public health picture is much more nuanced than what Mr. Rao is trying to say. I have not read Akar's book. I'm not sure about Rajiv. I'm guessing I'm guessing Akar has not read our book.
You're on the time so far.
No, I would like to read it. I've enjoyed reading his columns for multiple years, including in Pakistani newspapers, Express Tribune. He wrote a very good article about Pakistani caste system. Interesting. I thought it was very, very, very fascinating. But I've not read the book so far. I'm guessing he's not read our book either. I think the public health MMR and IMR data is very clear. It has been falling. The latest surveys, I think 2018 is the latest data we have. Yes, public health requires more investment. I fully agree with Mr. Rao. If nothing else, the pandemic has taught us that. We need more taxation for that, more formalization, more financialization, more growth for that.
We need industrial growth.
And for that, we need more reforms like labor reforms, farm reforms. Hopefully, the opposition is more constructive. It is more.
And we don't have NGOs disrupting big projects.
For example, on these metals and minerals, like Vedanta one, which Rajiv was referring to. So I partially agree with Mr. Rao and I partially disagree with him.
Okay, I think that was our last question. We have in excess of 35 questions. Apologies to everybody who wrote in. All I can say is we set out to do a listen and respond session, and I can say that we have listened and responded to, and I hope that we can also find some time to reflect on what we have listened and responded to. Thank you so much, Akar, Harsh, and Rajiv, for your time and for your patience and for indulging us with this experiment. Thanks everybody who joined us. And we will see you next time in an as interesting and hotting conversation as this evening was.
Thank
you, everyone. And
thank you, Akar. Thank you, Rajiv.
Thank you to the center and thank you, Lekha. Thank you very much. Thank you, Akar. Bye-bye.